Hi, welcome back to Web Design Basics. In this session, we're going to learn how to format anchor tags specifically for responsive design. I'm going to start with a amount of code that you see on your screen there. I've already done this in a previous tutorial, so if you need to pause the video and catch up, you're welcome to, but just a quick summary. All I really have here are a few different anchor tags inside of a nav tag. I'm not really worried about where they're going to go as far as these other pages go, but I've got a nav tag and I've got 3 anchor tags inside, and I've got a link up in the head tag to a CSS file that I'll create in just a few moments called style.css. So if you need to pause it to copy this down, go ahead and pause now and come back. Otherwise, I'm going to pop over to my CSS file so you can see what I've got there. I've got 2 CSS rules, one for the nav, which is actually going to format the nav bar itself. Let me show you what this end result's going to look like. This is what we've got formatted so far. We've got 3 anchor tags, home, about, and contact. Those are my 3 anchor tags in HTML, and the background is orange, and that is my nav tag. So the nav is got a background color of orange, a height of 40, text to line center, and the anchor tags are formatted with a lot of formatting here. Text decoration none, that takes the underline off, and the otherwise just spacing and type treatments to get it aligned right. So go ahead and copy that down as well. Pause the video if you need. And otherwise, we're going to look at how to maybe make this responsive. So here's the end result. Here's where we want to get today. I can shrink my browser window down and it'll mimic looking at it on a smaller window. And when I get to a certain size, you see that this just kind of pops into place and looks completely different. Now there's a lot of different formatting options we can do to these links, but ultimately I want to go from a standard nav bar to more of a stacked look for mobile phone viewing. So that's where we're headed. So I don't believe we're actually going to do much of anything in our HTML. Our HTML is going to stay exactly the same, which is the absolute purpose of responsive design. Responsive design isn't redesigning or relaying out anything. It's taking the existing HTML that you have and reformatting it with CSS. So to start out, what I want to do is copy all of this CSS code. I'm going to highlight it all, Command C or Control C, and we're going to go ahead and create a media query and paste this inside of it. So I'll hit enter a number of times so that we can scroll down here. So below all of that code, I'm going to type in my media query. This media query is going to be set up so that it will format anything on a screen that is less than 480 pixels wide. Media queries are CSS's answer to responsive design. Max width means that the browser window or the screen that they're viewing this on will be 480 pixels maximum. So more than likely this is going to be a smartphone size. Now the CSS property rules that I copied a moment ago will all go in here. Now please note this closing bracket here. If you want to put a comment, you can, and just write a note to yourself that says this closes the media query, because once we start adding in a whole bunch of CSS rules, you're going to have a lot of these opening and closing brackets. So anywhere in between there, I'm going to paste those same things, and typically this is the way that we start with responsive design. We'll copy the same code and then we'll simply modify what we want to change. So anything that was set up above that needs to stay can be deleted out of here. So for example, the nav bar in the first section above, I call this my everything section. The nav bar has been set to orange. It'll always be orange. I don't want to change it to anything else. So if that's the case, I want to go ahead and take this out. There's no need to have that in there. The height. Will the height of the nav bar always be 40 pixels like it is above? No, absolutely not. So in this case, I don't really know what the height should be. I want it to be fluid based on the phone's size, the screen size. And since I don't know what that number is going to be, I'm going to set it to auto, which means it'll automatically adjust as needed. It's very important that we have auto in there, because if you forget that, your nav will only be 40 pixels tall and it will never expand to be the height that it needs. Text align center, that's not going to change. I also want it to be text align center, just like the example above, so I can delete that. So really, I'm not doing anything extra to nav, with the exception of deleting a couple of things and changing the height to auto. I'll do the same thing line by line here for the nav A. All of my anchors should have a font size of 24. Is that true? If it's not, then we need to change it or delete it. I'm sorry, don't delete it. Change it if you don't want it to be the same. So I'll say 28. I'm going to make my font size a little larger, which is kind of strange because it's not very intuitive to want to make your fonts larger on a smaller screen. A lot of people think, oh, well, the screen is smaller, we better make our font smaller. But really it's the opposite. If your screen is smaller, you almost need your fonts to be larger so you can see them better. So I'm going to make my fonts a little bit bigger. I'll do 28 pixels. Will it always be Arial? Yes. Will it always be black? Yeah, I'm fine with that, so I can delete it. Text decoration, none. Yeah, that's not going to change. I'll delete that out of there. Font weight, bold. All of the things that it keeps from the CSS above, I can delete. Line height of 40. I'm going to leave that for right now, because I want to play with that a little bit and maybe see about changing the line height. So I'll leave it for right now. And then margins, I probably will have a margin. I doubt that it's going to stay that number, but I do want to keep it there for right now as well. I am planning to have a margin. So just like that, if we go ahead and save this, make sure my HTML is also saved. If I pull that up in my browser now and refresh it, it looks no different in my large view. It only looks different when you shrink your browser window down, and I can see a little bit of a shift in font size, which is really all that we've told it to do at this point. So let's go ahead and add in some new things to try to make this thing look a bit different. I'm going to add in a background color. Background color, and I'd like this to be a very light gray. So I'm going to choose DDD. Remember, grays are always triple letters, three of the same letter. So I'm going to go with DDD, and we'll see what that looks like. There we go. So it puts a background color around it. I'm certainly not crazy about the way that that is very, very tight in with that. So I know that I could add space around that if I add perhaps some padding. But I also have another problem, and I'm going to try to solve two birds with one stone here. I'm going to add in a CSS property called display. No, I'm sorry. Display. If I could spell it right. And block. Display of block. This is a CSS property and value that will essentially make whatever you're putting it on take up an entire block of text or an entire line of text. It's almost like you're putting in a line break after this so that it takes up a line all on its own. Now if we save it and go back and refresh our browser, we're going to see a big difference. Alright, so in my large browser, nothing changes, it looks the same, but in that small browser, now each one of these gray bars take up almost the full width of the nav. They stack right on top of each other, so it's really, really hard to tell what their heights are or where their separation is. I'm now going to go back and look at those two things I left, line height and margin. The margin is a space in between. Now, the 25 pixel margin that's on the left and right, I'm seeing right out here. That's what's causing that orange to show through. The 0 is top and bottom, and I'm going to go ahead and change that to something like maybe 5. And we'll see 5 pixels between each one of these now. So you can play with those numbers to get the separation of whatever you want, but essentially it's sort of like adding a border in between there, but all we're really doing is adding some space. Now I am a little bit perplexed as to why I don't see the border above and below. Whenever I put the margin at 5 on the top and bottom, theoretically it adds 5 to the top and 5 to the bottom of each one, but it doesn't look like I'm seeing that on the top and bottom one. And the answer to that is that I need to go back to my nav rule and add overflow hidden. Overflow hidden. If you watched some of my sessions before, you know that this is kind of a secret CSS property and value that will essentially make your background color show. The overflow is really what's outside of everything else. And by saying overflow hidden, we're saying hide the background and show this orange background. So in a nutshell, overflow hidden makes your background color show up appropriately, and that does the trick for us here. So you can play around with the margins a little bit more if you want to get the spacing at however you want, but for right now that looks pretty good. I think I'm okay with where that's at. Another property I'd like to add to this is something called border radius. And this is actually a CSS3 property, border radius, and I'm going to give it something about 15 pixels, and we can always change that. That should round off the corners around our rectangles here. So now, by rounding off the corners, it just makes those look a little more button-like. They look a little bit more button-like. And remember, large monitor, large screen, you're still staying with your standard nav bar, but on small responsive screen, we've got it formatted differently. I think the last thing I may throw in here is maybe a border. I'll put a 1 pixel border around these, and I don't want to do a really stark black. If I do black, I think it's going to stand out too much. Ugh. It's there. You can see the black border, but I'm not a huge fan of the way that looks. I'm going to make my border color 777. It's kind of a medium gray, simply because I don't want it to be that in your face. So you can put as many of these properties or as few of these properties on there as you want. Last thing, as I said earlier, we would look at the line height and maybe modify it a little bit. If we don't need it at all, we can also get rid of it. If I bump this up to 50 for the line height, essentially what that does is that makes the height of my button taller. So if you're okay with where it was at 40, you can actually delete it because it was already set to 40. But if you want it to be a little taller, you can certainly do that. 40 actually worked out okay for me. So as far as the properties go, these are pretty standard. If there's any that you don't want, like the border or the border radius, you can delete them. You can certainly play with those numbers, margins. Maybe I'll decrease this a little bit and increase it over here. Make this one 10 instead. So remember, the first number on margin, top and bottom. Second number is left and right. So I've decreased the space on the left and right and increased the space between. So there's no set rule for what that has to be. You can play with those numbers until you're comfortable with how the menu looks. So there you go. There's your very quick responsive navigation bar, and of course this can go inside of other elements, other divs. You can put it in a container or other things, and this responsive theory works across the board to all layout elements, but typically formatting anchors is one of the harder things. So hopefully that helps out a little bit. Try it out and let me know if you have questions. Thanks for viewing.